So next, we've got another very special and esteemed guest to present to you, and that will be David McNaughton, who is here with us in Cardiff. He's an honorary professor in the Department of Philosophy at Edinburgh University and emeritus professor of philosophy at Florida State University and at Keele University. He's the author of Moral Vision, among other books, and of a number of papers and chapters on moral philosophy and the philosophy of religion. He's editor of Joseph Butler's 15 Sermons and Other Writings in Ethics and Butler's Analogy of Religion, and is currently, I think, perhaps working on another work on Butler. Yes, there we go. So today he's going to be discussing Price's ethics in the paper Price, Clarke and Ethics. A warm welcome to you, David. Chris and Mal, thank you for coming down to Cardiff.
So, can you all hear me? Yep. Good. I'm afraid there aren't going to be any pretty pictures. Philosophers, as you've seen, don't do pictures. And I did think about doing text, but I'm never entirely convinced whether people just gaze at the screen. So I was brought up, of course, before any of these aids. You just gave a talk, so I'm just going to give a talk. Right, so there's a very long history of moral philosophers trying to explain or elucidate the nature of right action by appeal to the notion of fitness, or what is fitting. So here's just one example from C.D. Broad. When I speak of anything as right, I am always thinking of it as a factor in a certain wider total situation, and that I mean that it is fittingly related to the rest of this situation. Now, I said this idea has a long history. Like most of these things in philosophy, it goes out of fashion for 50 to 70 years, and then suddenly it's back in fashion, and most of the people who write about it have no idea that anybody else has ever written about it. So there's a vast literature about fitness and fittingness now, and only one person mentions Price, because of course they haven't read anything that's been published longer ago than 5 years. Well, I've always been puzzled by this for a number of reasons. The first obvious one is we just don't go around saying things like, this is a fitting action. Maybe people did in the past, though if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, it's not so clear it was ever very popular. So we don't, have an immediate grip. So this sounds like trying to explain the obscure by the more obscure. Secondly, there are people on each side, one lot, saying, I've no idea what this word means, and the other side saying it's perfectly obvious what it means. But nobody, or very few people, actually bother to define it. They just go on making confident announcements about when things are fitting and when they aren't. So I'm going to focus on this standoff between those who think the notion of fitness is useful and those who don't. So those who think that the term is useful, I'm going to call fitness advocates for obvious reasons. And on the other side, I have fitness skeptics. So skeptics doubt or deny, but in the sphere of ethics, as a concept of fitness that is interestingly distinct from concepts we're already familiar with, like duty and obligation. So either the term has no clear meaning, or it's simply an alternative way of saying that something is the right action. So, where are we going to go? Well, Brad Hooker once said that if a philosopher wrote a detective story, it would begin, "The butler did it. Here's why." So, my suspicion, particularly of modern discussions, is that some people who are keen on the notion of fitness equivocate. Sometimes when people talk about things being fitting, they just mean it's appropriate or correct. Right? Well, hardly anybody could disagree with the claim that the right action is the appropriate action, but it doesn't help us in the least understand anything we didn't know before. There's also a sort of thicker or more robust sense of fittingness in which we still do use the term, but it seems too specific to illuminate all of right action. And I think what tends to happen is people have in the back of their minds the sort of more interesting concept and slide backwards and forwards thinking it's obvious because fitting just means appropriate. But it's interesting because fitting has this place in the language. And I'll say much more about that later. Well, if you want to know anything about ethics, a good place to start is Price. And Price has wise things to say on this topic as well. So, Price is a fitness skeptic. And in particular, he's responding to earlier writers who waved the term fitness around in a rather vague way. And Price says, I think it just means the word right. Just to remind you what intuitionism is, Price is probably the last in a long line of 18th century intuitionists. And the fundamental principles of morality on this view are necessarily true. And they are also self-evident. So they can be known by rational reflection without appeal to observation. And they are normative. That is, they tell us what we ought to do. And Price's opponents in this are Hutcheson and Hume, and particularly Hume, who Hume thought all substantial knowledge comes from experience. Right? But you can't have experience that verifies moral truths. So there can't be these moral facts of the kind that Price likes. For those of you familiar with Kant, Hume takes all necessary truths to be analytic using Kant's distinction, whereas Price claims that there are synthetic truths, that is, substantial truths, known a priori. But he thinks that the fundamental principles of every branch of knowledge are like this. There's got to be at least one fundamental principle known a priori, because otherwise you'd have to appeal to further evidence, and at some point you appeal to some principle like we should expect the unobserved to resemble the observed. And if you say why, you just say think about it, right? So if I say you should keep your promises, and you say why, I just say, well, think about what a promise is, and so on. Right, so those of you, if anyone has, who wrestled with earlier writers, will, as Roger pointed out, feel more relaxed when you get to Price, because Price is very clear. and earlier writers are not. And that might be because, of course, they were struggling to find something, some way of expressing their views. And Price has the advantage of looking back and being able, as it were, to pick the best bits from the predecessors. Now, they employed a great variety of terms, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the most influential, Samuel Clarke, this is the Clarke who offered to prove the existence of God in the Boyle lectures. Some wag said that everybody believed in God until Clarke offered to prove his existence. So this is Clarke saying something rather obscure. Clarke says, this is his summary of his own position: different things bear necessary and eternal different relations to each other. From those relations flow a consequent fitness or unfitness of the application of different things one to another. This can't be said to be one of the more clear remarks in the history of philosophy. So it seems that Clarke regards fitness as what Ross, who we just heard about, calls a resultant property. That is, it's determined by other properties of the state of affairs we're looking at. So let's take a moral example. Take the relation of benefactor to the person benefited. And in virtue of that relation, Clarke thinks a further normative relation holds between the two, namely that it is fitting for the person benefiting to be grateful to her benefactor. And of course, it would be unfitting for her not to be grateful. So you start with the relation of benefactor to beneficiary, which is just a factual matter. I mean, scientific matter: has someone given you something good, and so on. And then Clarke thinks from that relation we can see that the person who's been given the benefit should be grateful. And the gratitude, of course, would depend on their resources, and they should at least thank their benefactor. Now, there's lots of puzzles about this. One is, well, Clarke would never have got a good degree. He talks about things, right? Things standing. Well, what are these supposed things that stand in these relations? You might think in the case of morality that it's going to be people, right? Since, George may have benefited Jim, and then Jim should be grateful to George, and so on. But he can't mean that, because it's just contingent that George has benefited Jim, and that therefore Jim ought to be grateful. Whereas he says these relationships are necessary. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, because it's sort of, typical stuff philosophers talk about and everybody goes to sleep. But Clarke's favourite illustration or analogy is mathematics, right? So he talks about proportion and disproportion in geometry and arithmetic, or uniformity or deformity in comparing together the respective figures of bodies, right? So what Price is thinking is, if you reflect on it, but the internal angles of a square are going to add up to, 360, isn't it? And but the sides are going to be of equal length. And you might know some more exciting things, like the internal angles of a plane triangle will equal 2 right angles, and so on. And here you're not talking about any particular triangle. You're just talking about the triangle, as it were. So now if we think about the benefactor and the beneficiary, what's the essential relation that holds between them? You can have entailment relations between properties. So you can say if something is red, then it's coloured. And of course, if it's blue, it's coloured, and so on. If someone is and you can get more complicated ones, like if someone is an uncle, then that person has at least one sibling, which you have to think about a bit more. And then you can get very complicated ones where, you know, particularly in relationships. And those sorts of entailments are necessary because they're timeless and eternal, as he says, right? So, you know, you're just thinking about the relation of benefactor to beneficiary or promiser to promisee. Also, these relationships might themselves depend on other truths, other facts. So what is it to be a benefactor? Well, a number of things have to be true. Right? You have to have given somebody something good, and you have to have done it intentionally. Right? If I, you know, I can do good to people whilst meaning to do them harm, and it doesn't make me a benefactor. But if all these things hold, and somebody is somebody's benefactor, you get a necessary truth according to Clarke. Necessarily, if X is the benefactor of Y, then it's fitting that Y should show gratitude to X. And how does this relate to ordinary life? Well, because each of us happens to stand in these various relationships at various points in their lives, and when they do, they should show gratitude. Right, so now we get to Price. Now, Price points out that there's a sort of set of related or interlocking terms that moral philosophers talk about. Terms like right, duty, obligatory, ought, and so on. And Price says that these are merely alternative terms for the concept of rightness. Right? Now, Price thinks, well, it's impossible to define rightness any more than you could define, say, yellow, right? Choose a famous example, because it's a fundamental concept that rational people have, which you can't acquire just by looking around. Hume, you know, pokes fun at all this, says, you know, examine any action said to be right, and points out you can't see the rightness, right? But that's not how you acquire, according to Price, the concept of rightness. Who would suppose that, you know, there was a particular sense that you used, and then you went, rightness, right, you know, just over there. So he thinks it's indefinable. And he also thinks, well, this is what he says, anyone considering whether he can point out any difference between what is right, meet, or fit to be done, and what ought to be done. It is not indeed plainer that figure implies something figured, solidity, resistance, or an effect or cause, than it is that rightness implies oughtness or obligatoriness. Right, fit, ought, should, duty, obligation convey then ideas necessarily including one another. So Price thinks that though there are alternative terms for right action, they all mean the same as right. So I might tell you, this is the right thing to do, this is what you ought to do, this is what you should do, this is your obligation, this is your duty, and I would be just saying, it's just varying phrases to make it less boring, right? We don't always want to keep using the same word. And Price turns to Clarke and the notion of fitness. And he points out that there are two uses of the term. One is when we simply mean that it's a suitable means to an end, right? The most infamous example, I suppose, is modern management speak, where people talk of things being fit for purpose, right? And it just means, that they're good means to whatever end it is. But Price thinks that, of course, there's another sense of fit in which certain actions are fit and other actions are unfit, but that just means the same thing as some actions are right and other actions are wrong. So you can't possibly explain the one by the other. Well, as I said, people came up with lots of different expressions. This is Price again. Acting suitably to the nature of things, treating things as they are, conformity to truth, agreement and disagreement, congruity and incongruity between actions and relations. These expressions, he says, are of no use and have little meaning if considered as intended to define virtue, for they evidently presuppose it. In given circumstances, there is something peculiar and determinate best to be done. This naturally leads us to speak of suiting actions to circumstances, natures and characters, and of the agreement or repugnancy between them. It is very obvious that there are only different phrases for right and wrong. This is my favourite bit. It is to be wished that those who have made use of these terms had avoided the ambiguity and confusion arising from them. So Price thinks that when people talk about things being fit or unfit, this is not a definition of virtue, nor does it justify the practice of virtue. It's simply restating the claim using other language. So Price could be seen as challenging the person who thinks fitness. Having discovered the term fitness, he's now going to tell us something really interesting and important. And at various times, people have nevertheless sort of tried to meet Price's challenge. And I'm going to talk just briefly about two of them. The first, now they're all intuitionists. So in the 20th century, as Roger was saying, there was a revival of ethical intuitionism. And the main people in this movement were Pritchard, Broad, Ross and Ewing. I'm just going to talk about Broad and Ross. So Broad says, when I speak of anything as right, I am always thinking of it as a factor in a certain wider total situation, and that I mean that it is fittingly related to the rest of the situation. This is quite explicit when we say that love is the right emotion to feel to one's parents, or that pity and help are the right kinds of emotion and action in the presence of undeserved suffering. What I have just asserted is not, and does not pretend to be, a definition of right and wrong. This kind of appropriateness and inappropriateness, which is implied in the notions of right and wrong, is, so far as I can see, specific and unanalysable. So Broad agrees with Ross that we can't analyse the notion, but he seems to think that right and wrong imply a very particular relationship called fittingness and unfittingness. So presume this is meant to be a helpful remark. Now, Broad then has an enormously long and complicated discussion, most of which I'm going to leave out. And he's replying to Sidgwick. So Sidgwick thinks that there are two kinds of moral philosopher. The strict deontologist, who thinks that there are exceptionless duties, of whom the most famous, of course, is Kant, who thinks that you should never tell a lie, and Elizabeth Anscombe, who famously said, if someone thinks in advance it's an open question whether we should hang an innocent person, I don't want to argue with him. He has a vicious mind. So, on that view, as it were, the Kantian view, once I've realized what I'm going to say is a lie, then moral thinking comes to an end, right? Indeed, you should avoid the temptation of doing any more thinking, right? Because you know what you ought to do, and thinking would simply be a way of trying to wriggle out of it in some way. Sidgwick himself believes in the theory of utilitarianism, that the right action is the one that would bring about the most benefit to all concerned. Now, Broad and Sidgwick both agree that strict deontology of the Kantian kind is implausible, but Broad thinks that utilitarianism is pretty implausible as well, and offers a kind of very British middle way, right? He actually cites the Anglican prayer book about the need to, have a middle way between papism and extreme Protestantism. So what we might call pure or strict intuitionism is too strict in claiming there are absolute duties and prohibitions, but correct in holding there are certain characteristics of actions that tell for or against its rightness, independently of the value of further consequences. And Roger and I could have a long talk about this, because Broad expresses this view by saying that certain kinds of action have a tendency to be right or wrong. Now, the utilitarian may agree that certain kinds of actions tend to be wrong, but he will understand tendency in a quite different way. For example, utilitarians could agree that lying tends to be wrong, by which they mean usually things turn out badly when you do this, right? But for the deontologist, it isn't that, don't lie because empirical experience suggests it doesn't work. But once you realize it's lying, there's a very strong reason not to do it. And you need a very good reason on the other side to outweigh it. So if you take the example Kant talks about lying to save an innocent man, the man with a bloody axe arrives at the door, says, "Where's Smith?" You have various choices. You can say nothing, in which case the man with the axe will presumably take it out on you, or you can lie, or you can tell the truth, right? Now, the sort of more moderate deontologists will say, well, look, this is one of the cases where not lying is overruled by immediately saving a life. So now Broad attempts to distinguish the way that deontology thinks things like lying affect rightness or wrongness by appealing to fittingness. So Broad takes the very interesting position that there are two kinds of consideration when you're doing moral thinking. The first is to think about fittingness and unfittingness, and the second is to think about utility, about the general good and evil, and then try and come to an answer. So he gives this example. Suppose I'm on an appointment board and one of the candidates has done me a service. To prefer him to a better qualified candidate might fit one aspect of the situation, for I should be grateful to benefactors, but unfitting to a different aspect of the situation as being an injustice to the other candidates. In such cases, leaving aside issues of utility, we need to form a judgment as to which action will be more fitting in the circumstances. So you start by asking which action is more fitting in the circumstances, and you look at things like lying and keeping promises, but you haven't finished because you then have to think which act best promotes utility, and then you have to balance utility against fittingness, right? By which time your head is swimming. And Broad says you have to arrive at an overall assessment of a weight to be given to utility as against a weight to be given to fittingness. Any such judgment is liable to be fraught with difficulties. Now, if Broad were right, Price would be wrong, right? Because Broad claims that the notion of fittingness is an important step on the way to working out what is right. The only problem is that no one has agreed with Broad about this. And this brings me to Ross. Now, in his later book on ethics, he wrote 2 books on ethics, he changes the language Roger was talking about, namely prima facie duties and duties overall, by talking about fittingness. And he says abroad, it seems to me then the rightness depends not on a joint consideration of fittingness and utility, but on a joint consideration of fittingness arising from utility and fittingness arising from other sources, such that a promise has been made. I feel myself no difficulty in recognising in the tendency which an actor has to amend the situation in the best possible way, that is to produce a maximum good, something in virtue of which that act tends to be fitting to the situation. Now, it's characteristic of these debates, Ross just makes this confident pronouncement. So, Broad says, I think there are 2 kinds of things, fittingness and utility. And Ross says, no, I thought about this. And it's all fittingness all the way down. You see what? He then spells out, and I won't go into all this, the notion of prima facie duties in terms of which fitness or suitability, and ends up by saying rightness can be identified neither with any and every degree of fitness, nor with complete fitness, but only with the greatest amount of fitness possible in the circumstances. That is, there are going to be many acts where, as it were, whatever you do, you're not going to do something that you feel you ought to do if it weren't for the fact you have to do something else. Right? So if I keep the promise, I may greatly disappoint my family. And if I please my family, I may break the promise. And neither of these will be completely fitting, but one will somehow be more fitting than the others. Right. Let us let's move on to contemporary debates since time is short. So one thing that Ross says that we're going to look at in a minute is he thinks that fitness or suitability is a category which has moral and aesthetic parts or species. You might think of a genus with species. So aesthetic suitability is when you think, this word just fits into the poem, or this element in the painting just fits with all the other elements. Well, let's go to modern philosophy. But this is an introduction to one of those huge volumes. The fittingness relation can be glossed as the relation in which a response stands to a feature of a world when that feature merits or is worthy of that response. It is thus the relationship in which each of our responses stand when I admire an admirable effort, you laud a laudable performance, and so on. The relevant attitudes or responses are merited by and hence fitting with respect to their objects. So this is a very broad definition, and I don't find it at all informative, because here fitting just seems to mean appropriate, right? The appropriate response to for the praiseworthy is to praise it, right? But we knew that. We could look in the dictionary and it would tell us that, the praiseworthy is what ought to be praised, or so I was suggesting that there may be a use of fittingness, as in that one, when really it doesn't mean anything much more than the correct or appropriate. But there could be more specific ones. And actually, I think the notion of what's fitting or unfitting is extremely interesting. No doubt someone's written a book about this, but I haven't found it. So think of things we do talk about as fitting or unfitting. Things like tributes or endings of a life or an enterprise or a novel, punishments and rewards, expressions of gratitude, and so on. So here are some examples. Retributivists want the punishment to fit the crime, right? And the lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, can seem attractive because the punishment perfectly matches the crime in being like it. We can see this in poetic justice, right? There is something especially fitting about the wrongdoer having an end similar to his victims. It's especially fitting, perhaps, if his downfall stems from his own machinations and his hoist of his own petard. So, Putin is a murderer of his own opponents and an aggressor towards Ukraine, so we might properly wish, at the least, that he fall from power. Now, this could happen if, as some suppose, he's suffering from an incurable disease. But it might have happened the other day had the march on Moscow by the Wagner mercenaries been successful. So both routes would have achieved the same end, but surely the second would have been agreeably fitting in a way, but the first wasn't. Putin enabled Wagner. He paid them. He helped recruit the people from prison to join it. So then he would have been toppled by the very tool that he employed to oppress other people. Now take an example of unfittingness. Rupert Brooke, right? If I should die, think only this of me. But there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England, right? How did Rupert Brooke die? Well, he got a mosquito bite on the troop ship, which became infected. And so he died of sepsis, right? Well, this doesn't seem a fitting end to, the golden boy who offered to die on the battlefield for England. And a final one, which is, I don't know how many people have seen this, there's an unveiling of the statue to Mary Wollstonecraft. Right? A lot of people said this is totally unfitting to a leader of feminism, of this sort of naked nymph emerging from, God knows what she's emerging from anyway. So it just doesn't. So the basic idea seems to be one of matching so to follow up on my suspicion, philosophers, I think, often tend to use common language in technical ways. And then the original kind of meaning of a term tends to creep back when they're not looking. So they use fitting just to mean, correct, appropriate. But then it has this very specific use. I think it has the use in ethics. For example, in punishment, you might think asking about fittingness is appropriate. In other cases, it just doesn't, seem to be a helpful remark. So, what are we to conclude? Well, Broad draws a very interesting distinction between the way that two kinds of consideration bear on rightness. Unfortunately, he doesn't explain why one should be spelt out in terms of fittingness and the other shouldn't. So either you say, yes, I got it, or, Ross, of course, consults his inner light and announces that Broad is wrong without offering any arguments at all. Now, Ross does think, but there is an analogy between moral fittingness and aesthetic fittingness, which is harmony. This is, of course, a tremendously old idea, going back at least 2,500 years, but the right is harmonious in some way, which is difficult to pin down. But that seems to me implausible. Firstly, there are just boring acts of duty where saying we should think about harmony just seems overblown. So I borrowed £5 off you, and then you say, can I have my £5 back? And I say, yeah, sure, here you are. And someone says, that's so harmonious. The other is when you get the enormously messy dilemmas you get in life, to start talking about, in harmony in art, and particularly in music, but other things, the idea is every bit contributes to the whole. Whereas on Ross's view, it's just some bits correspond to some parts, because they can't all correspond. Finally, we might think that the concept of harmony itself is equivocal, right? Because sometimes a discordant note is fitting in a piece of music. For instance, in Britain's War Requiem. And in this context, fitting can't mean what we usually mean by harmonious. So the idea that fitting and harmonious somehow mean, you might say that will harsh note exactly fits, but you wouldn't say it was harmonious. I mean, if you'd said it was harmonious, the composer would say you don't understand the music. The whole point was to find the least harmonious note I could find. So I'm sorry to say Roger has stolen my joke. Philosophers have very few jokes. Anyway, Price was right. I remain a fitness skeptic, and I think Price was right to be a fitness skeptic. One of the great strengths of Price is that when philosophers say the rather obscure and mystical things they tend to say, Price just says, you know, what exactly do you mean by that? And concludes, not very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Diolch yn fawr. Yeah, any questions for David? I'll keep an eye on the Zoom as well. Don't quite run off yet. David? No hands showing at the moment. Oh, James has got one for you here. If I can pass the microphone to you.
Thank you. I'm not sure that this is a fantastically well-formed question, but let's find out together. So I wanted to ask about the relation between Price's conceptions of reasons and norms and morals, just to get a sense of what kind of philosopher, what kind of moral philosopher he is. So according to Price, do we think it's possible that the higher standards of morality could demand that I do X, but perhaps could I then have the most reason to do Y?
Right.
Are these separate things? Or does he think that
Right.
what we ought to do is just what morality
Yeah,
requires?
I think Price's view is that there can't be a case where you have more reason to do a wrong thing. Right? If, for example, you have going to have to make an enormous sacrifice to give a very small benefit, right? Then it's not it would be right to give a benefit, but you know, oh, you've got most it'd just be wrong to give a benefit. Just the reasons Roger was talking about with Aristotle, right? If I'm making an enormous sacrifice to give somebody a very small benefit, then I damage myself and possibly my family and also other people who might have benefited. But the other thing which nobody's mentioned about Price, but is quite interesting, Roger was talking about supererogatory duties. These are ones that go above and beyond, right? So examples are, you know, the soldier throwing himself on the live grenade to save his comrades. You can't say, oh, what, just doing his duty? Actually, Price thinks that he is just doing his duty. It's just enormously difficult to do your duty in certain circumstances. So we praise him not for going above and beyond. I mean, how could you go above and beyond morality for someone like Price? What you're praising him for is doing something the rest of us wouldn't do, whilst feeling rather guilty about it.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, David. And I think we've got one last question before tea, and that's going to come from Roger. If you can unmute yourself, Roger. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Very, very quick question. At one point, you said we might want to use different concepts like rightness and reasons and fitness and so on, because it would be too boring if we didn't. But I mean, if you imagine the analog in science, you know, where Niels Bohr says, "Look, just talking about atoms all the time is really boring.
Yes.
Particles and, you know, rays and so on." It seems to me unreasonable. Really, I think we ought to be more parsimonious and just use the concepts that we need.
Yes, I think that's probably what Price thought. It's all right in ordinary speech to switch around all the time, and if we're going to be very precise, you know, price is, strictly speaking, wrong, because, so something can be a right action without it being the one you ought to do, because there might be two actions which are equally right, and so on. But, yeah, I think Price's main complaint is, as it were, philosophers are trying to explain something which, if you don't get it, we're not going to help you by saying, oh, rightness, right. Well, how about the eternal fitnesses of things, or suitable to truth and reason? Now, does that help? And the answer is no. Or, if someone had offered to use meetness as an explanatory concept, I think people would have, as in its right, meet and our bounden duty. Right? Someone said, is there a difference between right and meet? And you said, no, I got this complicated theory about that. I just think it's because fit comes with all these sort of trailing all this etymology behind it.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you very much to David, and thank you once again to Roger. There's a number of thoughts that I think I could expound on the basis of what I've heard this afternoon, but the Welsh cakes are awaiting us. But I think we've had it on very good authority this afternoon that, Price was right, and Price remains right, and as a moral philosopher that we should be, taking interest in today as well. So thank you so much for those contributions.